Daf Yomi, Tractate Bava Metzia, page 95a, top of the page, the words Ad Shifrot Lacha Hakasuv Yachtav. Unless the verse specifies that one is liable only where he curses both together, which it does not do in this case. Afilu tema Rav Yehoshua Lachalek Hachalot Sarich. The Gemara answer is, you can even say that Rabbi Natan's derivation from the word or is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. As here, in the verse concerning the borrower's liability, there is no need for the word or to divide the cases. What is the reason? The fact that injury and death are alone sufficient to engender liability is based on logical reasoning as follows. What difference does it make to me if it is entirely killed? And what difference does it make to me if it is partially killed, or it's injured? Either way, the animal is not in the state in which it was borrowed, so the borrower is liable to compensate the owner. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive the liability of a borrower in a case of a theft or loss? And if you would say, let us derive it from the fact that a borrower is liable if the animal entrusted him was injured or died, because theft and loss are similar to injury and death, in that there are cases of accidents, this derivation can be refuted. What is notable about a case in which the animal was injured or died? It is notable in that it no longer is possible to make an effort and bring the animal back to its undamaged state, and so it is reasonable that the borrower is liable for such occurrences. Shall you also say this ruling about a case of theft or loss, where it is still possible to make an effort to locate and bring back the animal? Since the animal is still extant, perhaps the borrower should not be liable. Rather, a borrower's liability for theft and loss is derived, like that which is taught in Braita from the verse, and it is injured or dies. Exodus 22:13. I have derived only that a borrower is liable if the animal is injured or dies. From where do I derive that he is liable in a case of theft or loss? You can say it is an a fortiori inference. If a paid bailee who is exempt from liability in a case in which the animal is injured or dies is nevertheless liable in a case of theft or loss, then with regard to a borrower who is liable in a case in which the animal is injured or dies, isn't it logical that he should also be liable in a case of theft or loss? As this is an a fortiori inference that has no refutation. The Gemara asks, what is added by the conclusion of the Braita that this is an a fortiori inference that has no refutation? The Gemara explains that the Braita anticipated the following rebuttal. And if you would say that the a fortiori inference can be refuted as follows. What is notable about the case of a paid bailee? It is notable in that he pays the double payment when he takes a false oath, stating the claim that the deposit was taken by an armed bandit. If so, can you derive a halacha from the case of a paid bailee to that of a borrower who pays only the principal in such a case? It would appear that a borrower does not always bear a more severe level of liability, and the a fortiori inference is thereby undermined. Anticipating this refutation, the Braita states that it is invalid, because even so, the fact that a borrower is liable to pay the principal when he claims the deposit was taken by an armed bandit without the liability to exempt himself by taking an oath is a greater stringency than the fact that a paid bailee is liable for the double payment, but only if he takes a false oath to that effect. Consequently, a borrower has a more severe level of liability, and the a fortiori inference is valid. Alternatively, if you wish, say that the Braita holds that an armed bandit is classified as a robber. The paid bailee is not liable for the double payment if he claims that the deposit was taken by an armed bandit. The double payment is paid only for a false claim of theft, not robbery. Consequently, the basis of the refutation is flawed. The Gemara asks, we have found sources for the liability of a borrower in a case of theft or loss. From where do we derive a source for the halakha that in a case of theft or loss he's exempt? If he had also borrowed the services of the owner at the same time as borrowing the animal, the verse describing his exemption from liability is stated only with regard to a case in which the animal entrusted to him is injured or dies. See Exodus 22:13. And if you would say, let us derive from the fact that a borrower who also borrowed the services of the owner is exempt if the animal is injured or dies, as the type of occurrence should not make any difference, then one can counter, what is notable about a case in which it is injured or dies? It is notable in that it is an unavoidable accident. And so, it is reasonable that one's liability be limited. Can you say the same in a case of a theft or loss, which theoretically he could have prevented? Rather, derive the halakha that a borrower who also borrowed the services of the owner is exempt if the animal is injured or dies, from the halakha of a paid bailee, who is exempt from theft and loss if he had borrowed the services of the owner at the same time as the animal. The Gemara asks, but from where do we derive that the exemption from liability also applies to a paid bailee himself? We derive the limitation of liability of a paid bailee from the limitation of liability of a borrower, just as below with regard to a borrower. For those cases in which the verse states that he is liable, it states that if he borrowed the animal together with the services of the owner, that he is exempt. So too here, with regard to a paid bailee, for those cases in which he is liable, if he undertook to safeguard the animal together with borrowing the services of the owner, then he is exempt. The Gemara asks, through what method is this derived? If it is derived through the interpretive principle known as what do we find, a Metzia, a comparison between cases with similar details, this can be refuted. Just as we refuted the possibility of deriving a limitation on one's liability in the case of theft or loss from a case in which the animal was injured or died, because a case in which it is injured or dies is an unavoidable accident, it is reasonable that one's liable be limited specifically to such circumstances. Rather, is derived as follows. The verse states, and if he borrows, Exodus 22:13. The conjunctive and indicates that the passage detailing the liability of a borrower is added to the first matter, in other words, the halachot of a paid bailee. And therefore, let the case of a paid bailee above be derived from the case below of the borrower, and the halachot applying the case below of a borrower can be derived from the case above of a paid bailee. An Amoraic dispute was stated with regard to a mishap that occurred due to a borrower's negligence in safeguarding the deposit he borrowed together with the services of its owner. Rav Acha and Ravina disagree. One sage says he is liable, and one sage says he is exempt. The one who says he is liable holds that the verse beginning and if he borrows, which details the exemption from liability when one borrows an item together with its owner, is expounded in connection with the passage preceding it. In other words, that of a paid bailee, but not in connection with the passage preceding the one preceding it, meaning that of an unpaid bailee. Accordingly, the verse, if his owner is with him, im ba'alav imo, he does not pay, Exodus 22:14, which appears in the passage of a borrower, is not written in reference to an unpaid bailee, and so that exemption from liability does not apply to him. And in addition, liability for negligence, which appears in the passage of an unpaid bailee, is not written in reference to a paid bailee or a borrower. Accordingly, the liability of a paid bailee and of a borrower in a case of negligence is derived only via an a fortiori inference from the liability of an unpaid bailee, not from an explicit verse. Im bebalim liftor v'shover sachar v'shalo. My time kiksiv in balimo lo yishalim ashal v'shomer sachar ahana chiyuvi diksiv b'hu b'hedye hu d'michtav. Basically, we're saying here that it's not possible to derive that even a paid bailee and a borrower are exempt in cases where they took hold of an item together with borrowing the services of its owner, and a mishap occurred due to their negligence. What is the reason for this? When it is written, if its owner is with him, he does not pay it. That is a reference to a borrower and a paid bailee. Even then, it is written in reference to only those liabilities that are written explicitly with regard to them. It is not written with regard to their liability for negligence, which is derived only through an a fortiori inference. Consequently, the borrower and the paid bailee are liable for negligence, even in a case where they also borrowed the services of its owner. Conversely, the one who says that the borrower is exempt holds that the verse, and if he borrows, which details the exemption from liability in a case where one borrows an item together with the services of its owner, is expounded in connection with the passage preceding it. In other words, that of a paid bailee, and also in connection with the passage preceding the one preceding it. In other words, that of an unpaid bailee. And accordingly, when it is written, if its owner is with him, he does not say the exemption is written also in reference to an unpaid bailee, limiting his liability even in a case of negligence. The Gemara suggests proofs for each opinion. We learn in the Mishnah that in the case of one who borrowed a cow and he borrowed the services of its owner together with it, or one who borrowed a cow and he hired its owner with it, or if one borrowed the services of the owner or hired him and afterward borrowed the cow. In all such cases, if the cow died, the borrower is exempt. The Gemara explains the proof. The Mishnah mentions in the exemption from liability with regard to a borrower, whereas it does not teach it with regard to an unpaid bailee who is liable only for a mishap that was the result of his negligence. Presumably, this is because the exemption from liability does not apply to a mishap that is the result of the bailee's negligence. The Gemara rejects the proof, but even according to your reasoning, does it teach exemption from liability with regard to a paid bailee? It does not. Although it certainly applies to at least cases of theft and loss. Rather, with regard to the Tana of the Mishnah, the matter